Imagine waking up after death and realizing the first thing waiting for you is not fire, not a throne, not a voice from the sky telling you where you went wrong, just a scale. On one side, your heart, the actual heart that beat inside your chest for every moment of your life, the heart that raced when you fell in love, that sank when you failed someone you cared about, that kept going through every ordinary Tuesday you barely remember. On the other side, a single feather, and kneeling beside that scale, adjusting it with hands that have done this 10,000 times before, is a figure with the head of a jackal and the body of a man, painted black from head to foot. He is not looking at you. He is looking at the scale, because the scale is the only thing that matters right now. Not who you knew, not what you owned, not how many people showed up to your funeral, just the weight of everything you ever did, compressed into the one organ you could never lie to. His name is Anubis, and before this is over, you will understand why one of the greatest civilizations in human history chose this image, this moment, this figure, as one of the most unforgettable images at the center of Egyptian thinking about what happens after death. There is a house made of mud brick on the edge of the Nile. Inside that house, a family is sitting in the dark. The man who built the house is dead. He was not a king. He was not a priest or a general or anyone whose name would be carved into stone for future generations to find. He was a craftsman, maybe a farmer, someone who woke up every morning before sunrise, did his work, came home to people who needed him, and then, one day, did not wake up anymore. His body is still in the room. His family knows what is coming. They know that in a matter of hours, they will have to think about practical things. Who to call, what needs to happen next, the decisions that death forces on the living before the living are ready to make them. But right now, in this moment, before any of that begins, there is only one question, and the question is not why he died. The question is what happens to him now, not to his soul in some abstract sense, to him, to the specific weight and shape of the person who slept in this house, who had a name that his children could pronounce before they could say almost anything else, who had a face that his wife had looked at so many times it had become part of how she understood the world. What happens to that? This is the question that Anubis was built to answer, not by promising that everything would be fine, not by offering comfort in the easy, unconditional way that costs nothing, but by doing something far harder and far stranger, by standing at the most terrifying threshold in human experience and making it possible to cross. The ancient Egyptians looked at death and they saw something that could be survived, not avoided, not denied, survived, if the right things were done, by the right people, in the right order, with the right God watching over every step. That God had the face of the animal they found circling their cemeteries at night. And that choice, that decision to take the thing they feared most and make it the face of their protector, tells you everything you need to know about who the ancient Egyptians were. We are going to start in the desert. Stand at the edge of an ancient Egyptian cemetery as the sun goes down. Not the Egypt of tourist photographs, not the Egypt of golden light on pyramid stones, the real working edge of an ancient city, where the green land along the Nile gives way to sand, where the soil stops being fertile and starts being desert, where the living built their homes on one side of a line and buried their dead on the other. The graves out here are shallow. That is the first thing to understand. The deep, elaborate tomb complexes that archaeologists excavate today belong to royalty and the very wealthy. Most Egyptians were buried in relatively simple graves, dug into the desert floor at the boundary between the green world and the dead one. And at sunset, when the light went flat and the shadows stretched long across the sand, the Canids came, Jackal-like desert animals had been moving through the cemeteries of Egypt for as long as there had been cemeteries in Egypt. They were drawn by what was buried there. They dug. They disturbed the graves. They threatened the physical integrity of the bodies beneath the sand. This was not a myth. This was not a symbol. This was something that happened consistently at the edges of real places where real people buried their real dead. And it terrified them in a way that went far deeper than ordinary fear. Because in ancient Egypt, the body was not optional. We will get to the theology of that shortly. But for now, understand the basic terror. You buried someone you loved, and then something came in the night and threatened to take them apart, to scatter what you had carefully placed, to reduce the person to components, to pieces, to nothing recognizable. The ancient Egyptians were not the only people who faced this problem. Cultures all over the ancient world dealt with the practical challenge of protecting graves from scavengers. Most of them responded in practical ways. They buried deeper. They placed stones over graves. They built walls. The Egyptians did something else entirely. They looked at the animal circling the cemetery and they made it a god. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not an obvious choice. Every other response to a threat that circles your dead is defensive. You build barriers. You create distance. You try to push the danger away from the thing you are protecting. The ancient Egyptians looked at the jackal-like canid, with its long ears and its yellow eyes, and its willingness to go places that living humans would not follow. And they thought, that is exactly the creature we need standing watch, the thing that knows the cemetery better than we do, the thing that moves through the edge of the dead world without fear, the thing that was there before we arrived and will be there after we leave. Give that thing a human body. Give it a divine purpose. Point it in the right direction. And what was a threat becomes a guardian. This is not naive. This is not the thinking of people who did not understand danger. This is the thinking of a civilization that understood something profound about power. The most effective protection comes from something that already belongs to the space you are trying to protect. You do not guard a fire by surrounding it with water. You guard a fire by understanding fire. You do not guard the dead by surrounding them with the living. You guard the dead by giving authority to something that already knows how to move in the world of the dead. The Egyptians did not worship the jackal because they thought it was gentle. They gave it a divine face because it stood exactly where fear stood. And they decided that was where they needed a god. The first time most people in the modern world encounter Anubis, they see black and they think dark. They see the jackal head, the black skin, the association with death and tombs and things that happen in the night, and they filter it through everything their own culture has ever told them about what the color black means. Danger, the absence of light, the end of things. That is the wrong lens entirely. To understand what the ancient Egyptians meant when they painted Anubis black, you have to understand what black meant in a world built around the Nile. Every year, the Nile flooded. This was not a disaster. This was the event that made Egyptian civilization possible. The floodwaters rose, spread across the surrounding land, and when they receded, they left behind a layer of rich, dark silt, the most fertile soil in the ancient world. The Egyptians called this black land Kemet. They called the desert the Red Land. And the difference between those two colors was the difference between life and death. Black was the color of the earth that fed them. Black was the color of abundance, of possibility, of the ground that would take a seed and return it as grain. Black was not the color of ending. Black was the color of what came after ending, the transformation that turned death back into life. When the ancient Egyptians painted Anubis black, they were associating him with fertility, renewal, and the black soil that made life return after the flood. The second layer of meaning is the mummy. When the embalming process was complete, when the body had been treated with natron and oils and resins, and wrapped in linen, the preserved mummy was dark, not the pale, washed-out color of untreated death, dark, almost black, with the preserved flesh having taken on the color of the materials used to protect it. The blackness of a successfully mummified body was evidence that the process had worked. It was the color of preservation, of protection, of a body that would not dissolve back into the sand, but would hold its shape, hold its identity, hold the possibility of everything the afterlife required. Anubis was painted in that color deliberately. He was the god whose job was to ensure that transformation happened correctly. His color was the color of a process completed, the color of protection that had actually protected. And then there is the third layer, which is perhaps the most beautiful. The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun died every evening and was reborn every morning. The sun literally traveled through the underworld each night, a dangerous journey through darkness that it had to survive in order to rise again. Every sunrise was a resurrection. Every new day was proof that the journey through the dark was survivable. The color of that journey was black. The god who presided over thresholds, over crossings, over the passage from one state to another, wore the color of the night that the sun crossed every single day without fail and emerged from every single morning. Anubis was not painted black because he represented the worst of what could happen. He was painted black because the ancient Egyptians looked at the darkest part of the cycle and recognized it as necessary, as survivable, as the condition that made the light on the other side possible. That is a different relationship with darkness than most of us were taught to have, and it starts to explain why Anubis was never, in the world that created him, something to be afraid of. He was something to be grateful for. There was a craftsman named Ka who lived in the village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of the Nile, sometime around 1400 years before the Common Era. We know he existed because his tomb was found intact in 1906, still sealed, still containing the objects his family placed there for him. His tools, his furniture. His wife Merit was buried alongside him. Their linen was still folded. Their food offerings had simply dried out over 3,000 years. Ka was not famous. He was a foreman of the royal tomb workers, a skilled man, respected in his community, but not someone whose name was meant to echo through history. He lived, he worked, he died, and the people who loved him did everything in their power to make sure that death was not the end of him. That effort, everything they did in the days and weeks and months after Ka stopped breathing, was built around a specific understanding of what a human being actually was. And that understanding is where most modern people and ancient Egyptians part ways completely. We tend to think of a person as essentially one thing, a body that contains a mind, or a soul that inhabits a body, depending on what you believe. When the body stops working, whatever you think the essential person is either ends or continues. But it is one thing that either survives or does not. The ancient Egyptians looked at a human being and saw something much more complicated. They saw a person as an assembly, a collection of distinct components, each with its own nature, each with its own vulnerabilities, each capable of being lost in its own specific way. Every single one of those components could vanish. The first was the physical body itself. This was the most obvious vulnerability. The one the jackal-like canids at the cemetery edge represented every night. A body left unprotected would dissolve back into the sand. It would lose its shape, its form, its ability to serve as an anchor for anything that came after. The body was not a disposable container. It was a necessary foundation. The second was the Ka, a word that Egyptologists sometimes translate as the life force, or the vital essence. The Ka had a specific relationship with the physical body after death. It needed somewhere to return to. It needed the body to remain recognizable, to remain present, to remain somewhere the Ka could find its way back. Without a preserved body, The car had nowhere to go. It would wander, untethered, unable to complete the journey it needed to complete. The third was the bar, which is perhaps the hardest to translate cleanly. The bar was the individual personality, the specific collection of qualities and memories and characteristics that made Ka into Ka and not someone else. In Egyptian funerary art, the Ba is depicted as a bird with a human head, because it could move freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But even the Ba needed to return to the body each night. It needed an anchor. It needed home. The fourth was the Ren. The Ren was a person's name, not their reputation, not their legacy in the sense we usually mean, the actual name, the specific word that other people use to call them into presence, was understood as a component of the person, as real and as necessary as their flesh and blood. If a name was erased from every surface it had been carved into, if no living person ever spoke it again, the person it belonged to was diminished in a way that was not metaphorical. They were partially destroyed. This is why the ancient Egyptians carved names everywhere. This is why names appear on tomb walls and funerary objects and amulets, keeping the name visible, keeping it spoken. There was an act of preservation as practical and as urgent as wrapping a body in linen. And the fifth was the IB, the heart, not the organ exactly, or not only the organ. The IB was the seat of consciousness, the center of moral life, the place where every decision a person had ever made was recorded and carried forward. The ancient Egyptians did not believe the brain was the center of thought and feeling. They believed the heart was. When they embalmed a body, they removed the brain and discarded it, because the brain was not essential. But the heart stayed in the body, always, because the heart had a future appointment. Stand back and look at what this understanding of the human person actually implies. A person is not one thing that either survives death or does not. A person is 5 things, at minimum, each of which requires specific conditions to continue, each of which can be threatened in its own specific way. The body can be destroyed by exposure and time. The car can be left homeless if the body disappears. The bar can be cut off from its anchor if the preservation fails. The name can be erased by enemies or indifference, or the slow erosion of generations. And the heart can fail a test that every heart, without exception, must eventually face. Anubis was not created to guard against death in the abstract. He was created to stand between a specific person with a specific name and a specific heart and a specific body that specific people had loved, and the 5 different ways that person could be erased from existence entirely. That is a much more precise job than God of Death. That is a job description built out of the most intimate terror that a civilization could construct, the fear that the person you love most could be taken apart, piece by piece, until nothing of them remained. Ka's tomb was sealed for 3,300 years. His name was still there when they opened it. So was his linen. So was his wife. The people who buried them understood exactly what they were protecting, and they did not stop at any single layer of it. Look at any ancient Egyptian city from above, and you will see the same organizing principle repeated across every settlement, from the smallest farming village to the capital city of a great dynasty. On one side, the Nile, green, loud, full of life and commerce, and the sounds of people going about the business of being alive. The Black Land, Kemet, where the fertile silt made everything possible, where children grew up and markets opened every morning, and the whole complicated machinery of civilization ran. On the other side, the desert, silent, still, the Red Land, Deshret, where the sand began and the green stopped and nothing grew without intervention, where the sun was harder, the nights colder, and the distance from the river felt like a distance from the world itself. The Egyptians buried their dead in the desert, not because they wanted to push the dead away from the living, though the practical separation made sense. They buried their dead in the desert because of direction, because of the sun. The sun rose in the east, over the Nile, over the green land, over the world of the living. It moved through the sky all day. And in the evening, it set in the west, into the desert, into the red land, into the world that lay on the other side of ordinary life. The Egyptians called the dead the Westerners, people who had gone in the direction the sun went every evening, people who had followed the light into the place where the light went to travel through the dark before it could rise again. The cemetery was not simply a storage facility for bodies. It was a threshold, the physical boundary between two worlds that existed side by side, separated by the width of the green land's edge, but as different from each other as the living from the dead. And Anubis was the god of that threshold. His ancient titles reach back to the earliest layers of Egyptian religious life. The world of funerary deities and canine figures in ancient Egypt was complex and layered across many centuries, with different names and attributes accumulating around the figure we know as Anubis. Some titles pointed to his role as guardian of what lay in the west. Some pointed to his presence at the boundary itself. But running through all of them is the same essential idea. Anubis was the god who stood at the edge, not inside the world of the living, not deep in the world of the dead, at the line between them. This sounds like a minor distinction until you think about what it actually means to inhabit that position. The threshold is the most important place in any transition. It is where the rules change, where what applied a moment ago stops applying and what will apply next has not yet fully taken hold. The threshold is the most vulnerable moment, and the most powerful one. The instant when something is neither what it was nor what it will be. Anubis owned that instant. He owned the moment when a living person became a dead one. The moment when a body passed from the hands of the family into the hands of the embalmers. The moment when a completed mummy was carried out of the house of embalming and into the tomb. The moment when the tomb was sealed and whatever happened next began. He owned every crossing. The cemetery itself, in ancient Egypt, was not the abandoned and slightly uncomfortable place that modern Western culture has made of it. It was an active space, a maintained space, a place with its own economy of priests and caretakers and ritual specialists who tended to the dead on behalf of the living. It was, in a sense, a city for a different population, parallel to the city of the living, operating according to its own rules. Anubis was the lord of that city. Lord of the sacred land is one way to translate the ancient designation for his domain. The sacred land was the necropolis, the city of the dead, the area of desert on the west bank, where the tombs were cut into the rock and the grave goods were sealed behind stone doors, and the whole infrastructure of Egyptian death, religion operated according to a logic that had been refined over thousands of years. He was not there as a threatening presence. He was there as a governing one. Think about what it means to have a god whose specific domain is the space between. Most gods in most traditions rule over something definite. Sky, sea, war, harvest. These are domains with clear content, clear subjects, clear responsibilities. Anubis ruled over the moment of transition itself. His domain was not a place so much as a process. The process of becoming. In the most radical sense, the process of a living person becoming whatever came next. That is an extraordinary thing to be the god of. Not death as an ending. Death as a crossing. Not a wall, but a door. Not a termination, but a passage that required guidance, protection, and someone who knew the territory on both sides. As the light failed each evening over the desert cemeteries of ancient Egypt, as the sand turned from gold to grey, and the stars began to appear in the sky above the tombs, the god of the threshold was already there. He had never left. He was the one constant in a landscape that changed with every death. Every burial, every family that came to the edge of the green world and stopped, because they could go no further, and someone else had to take over from there. That someone was Anubis, standing at the boundary, waiting, as a promise that the crossing would not be made alone. They called it the Per Nefer, the beautiful house, not the house of death, not the house of the dead, the beautiful house, which is what you call a place when you understand that what happens inside it is not an ending, but a transformation. And you want the name to carry that understanding into every ritual performed within its walls. Step inside. The first thing you notice is the smell. Natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds across Egypt. Sharp and mineral, and clean in the way that only very dry things can be clean. Cedar oil imported from the forests of Lebanon. Rich and dark. The kind of smell that tells you something valuable and far-traveled has entered the room. Resin from trees that grew along the edges of the known world. Linen. Clean linen. Folded in quantities that seem excessive until you understand how much of it the process requires. The light comes from oil lamps set into niches in the walls. The shadows they cast are deep and specific. The kind of shadows that make a room feel smaller than it is, that pull the walls inward and concentrate everything toward the center, toward the table, toward the work that has to be done. There is no talking unless the ritual requires it. The silence in the Per Nefer was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of precision, of people doing something that could not afford mistakes, something where every step mattered and every error had consequences that extended far beyond the room and far beyond the moment. The process that happened in this room took 70 days. Some interpretations connect this 70-day period with celestial cycles, especially the disappearance and return of Sirius. The star the ancient Egyptians associated with the goddess Isis. For approximately 70 days each year, Sirius vanished from the night sky before reappearing on the horizon just before the annual Nile flood. 70 days of absence, followed by return. The body spent 70 days in the beautiful house, held between states, neither fully dead nor ready for what came next, before it emerged, transformed, and prepared for its own return. What happened in those 70 days was both extraordinarily practical and deeply sacred. And in ancient Egypt, those two things were never actually in opposition. The brain was removed first, drawn out through the nasal passage with specialized tools. This sounds brutal to modern ears, but the Egyptians were not being careless with the most important organ. They genuinely believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of thought and consciousness and moral life. The brain was not essential to what the person would need in the afterlife. The heart was, so the brain was removed, and the heart was left carefully in place. Because the heart had an appointment, the internal organs came next. The lungs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, each removed with care and placed into separate containers. The canopic jars, each protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, each sealed and stored in the tomb alongside the mummified body. Nothing that had been part of the person was simply discarded. Everything was preserved. Everything was given a guardian, because every part of the person mattered to the continuation of the person. Then came the natron. The body was packed in the salt, inside and out, and left to dry. What emerged afterward was desiccated, darkened, the familiar architecture of the face still present beneath the changed surface. Then the wrapping, hundreds of yards of linen, wound in specific patterns, with specific amulets placed at specific points on the body as the wrapping progressed. Each amulet had a purpose. Each placement corresponded to something the priests understood about the vulnerabilities of the body and the protections it would need. This was not decoration. This was armor. built layer by layer around a person who was going to travel somewhere extremely dangerous and needed everything working in their favor. And through all of it, through every step of those 70 days, Anubis was present, not as a statue in the corner, though his image was certainly on the walls. Present in the sense that every action taken in that room was understood as being performed under his authority and with his oversight. The embalming priests were not simply technicians executing a process. They were agents of Anubis, working in his domain, doing the work that his mythology had established as his when he performed it for the first time on the body. That would become the model for every embalming that followed. We will get to that story soon. For now, stand in the Pernifer and understand what it represents. The ancient Egyptians looked at the most terrifying physical reality of death, the body's tendency to dissolve, to come apart, to lose the shape that made it recognizable as the person it had been. And they built a whole institution to refuse that dissolution. 70 days of skilled labor, generations of accumulated knowledge, an entire professional class of people whose life's work was to stand between a human body and the process of becoming nothing. They did this because they believed the body mattered, that it was not a temporary vehicle to be shed and left behind, but a necessary part of the person that had to be maintained and protected and preserved if the person was going to have any chance at what came next. That belief required a God who understood bodies, who knew the difference between a body that had been properly preserved and one that had not, who could oversee a process this precise and this consequential and ensure that nothing was done wrong. Anubis was that God. The beautiful house was his house, and every body that entered it was under his protection from the moment the family handed their loved one over to the priests and walked back toward the green world, back toward the sound of the river and the noise of the living, leaving the silence and the natron smell and the lamplight and the work behind them. 70 days to make sure that one person did not vanish. 70 days to insist that death was not the final word. That is what happened in the beautiful house, and that is why they named it Beautiful. You are standing outside the Pernefer. You are not allowed inside. No family members are. The work that happens in the beautiful house requires a particular kind of silence and a particular kind of focus that the presence of grieving people would disrupt. And the priests have learned over generations that the separation, as painful as it is, serves a purpose that goes beyond the practical. So you stand outside, you wait, and through a doorway that is not quite fully closed, in a moment between one ritual and the next, you catch a glimpse of the figure moving inside. It does not have a human face. What you see in that doorway, for the few seconds before the door is pulled back into position, is the long dark head of a jackal, the upright ears, the eyes that catch the lamplight in a way that human eyes do not, a human body beneath it, robed and moving with the practiced economy of someone who has done this thousands of times. But above the shoulders, the unmistakable face of the god. You are looking at Anubis, or rather, you are looking at a priest who is wearing Anubis. The evidence points to the practice of a priest donning the mask of Anubis in certain funerary ritual contexts, becoming, at least in the visual and symbolic sense, the god himself for the duration of the ceremony. The mask was not a costume worn for effect, it was a transformation, or something that functioned as a transformation. A deliberate collapse of the distance between the human agent and the divine authority under which the work was being performed. Think about what that means from where you are standing. You cannot see a man doing difficult and intimate work with the body of someone you loved. What you see, in that brief glimpse, is the God whose entire existence is dedicated to protecting that body, doing the work himself. The theological claim that Anubis oversees the embalming process is not an abstraction happening somewhere in the invisible world. It is happening right there, in that room, with hands you can almost see moving under a face you recognize from every tomb painting you have ever stood in front of. The ancient Egyptians understood something about the relationship between ritual and reality that is easy to miss from the outside looking in. Within the Egyptian ritual imagination, the ritual was not merely representation, it was participation in reality. When a priest put on the mask of Anubis and knelt beside a body and performed the work that Anubis performed in the mythology, Anubis was present in that room in the only way that mattered. The work was being done with divine authority, under divine protection, according to the pattern that the divine had established. The distinction between a priest pretending to be Anubis and Anubis acting through a priest may seem like a fine point from where we stand 3,000 years later, but stand in the position of the family outside that door. You have just lost someone, the person who held the shape of your daily life, who occupied a specific chair at a specific table, whose voice you have not yet learned to stop expecting to hear, is in that room. And what you have been told, what your entire religious understanding has prepared you to believe, is that the God who invented the art of preservation, the God who performed it first on a divine body and proved that it could work, is in that room with them right now, at least in this moment. And in the ritual imagination it represents, Anubis is not distant. He accompanies. The priest behind the mask took that belief and made it visible, not by claiming anything false, by enacting something true that in this space, in this work, under these conditions, the human and the divine were doing the same thing at the same time, and the line between them was thin enough that a mask could close it. When the ritual was finished, when the day's work in the Pernefer was done, the priest removed the mask. The face of Anubis came off. The human face beneath it emerged. Tired, probably. Focused in the way that skilled people look after hours of demanding work. The god stepped back. The man stepped forward. But for the family waiting outside, something had already happened that no removal of any mask could undo. Their loved one had been in the presence of Anubis. To the family watching, the distinction may not have mattered. The god's face was there, and the body was no longer alone. That was the whole point. That has always been the whole point. The mask of Anubis was not worn to make the ritual more dramatic or the priests more impressive. It was worn because the people who came to that door needed to believe that what was happening inside was more than human. And the extraordinary thing is that, within the framework of what those people understood about the world, they were not wrong. Something was being done in that room that no purely human effort could have accomplished alone. Not the physical work of preservation. That was extraordinary. But it was human. The promise that the preservation carried. The guarantee that a body carefully protected by the right people in the right way with the right intentions could serve as the anchor for everything the dead person needed to continue. That promise came from somewhere beyond the room, and the mask made sure that everyone who needed to know that knew it. There is a particular kind of fear that does not get talked about enough in conversations about ancient Egyptian death religion. Not the fear of dying, not the fear of what comes after. Something more specific, more practical, and in some ways more terrifying than either of those. The fear that the ritual would be done wrong. The ancient Egyptians built one of the most elaborate systems of funerary practice in the history of human civilization. 70 days of embalming, specific prayers at specific moments, specific amulets placed at specific locations on the wrapped body, specific words spoken in a specific order at the moment of burial, specific offerings maintained at specific intervals after the tomb was sealed. Every single one of those specifics mattered. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. This was a highly developed understanding that the transition from death to continued existence was a process. And like any complex process, it could fail at any point where the required conditions were not met. Think about it in terms that feel familiar. If you are crossing a dangerous mountain pass in winter, the right equipment matters. The right guide matters. The right path matters. A single wrong turn. A single piece of missing gear. A single moment of inattention at the wrong time can be the difference between making it through and not making it through. The danger is not abstract. It is specific. And the preparation has to be specific in response. The ancient Egyptians understood the journey through death in exactly those terms. The Duat, the realm of the dead, was not a vague spiritual dimension. It was a place with geography, with gates that required passwords, with guardians who demanded that the traveler prove who they were and demonstrate the right to pass, with dangers that could be navigated if you knew what you were doing, and that would stop you cold if you did not. Getting a person successfully through that journey required getting every step right, from the moment of death to the moment the heart was weighed, and every step between. If the embalming was incomplete, the body might not provide the anchor the car needed. If the wrong oils were used, or used in the wrong order, the preservation might fail in ways that undermined the whole structure. If a prayer was mispronounced, if an amulet was misplaced, if the wrong spell was read at the wrong moment, the consequences were not symbolic. They were real, in the sense that everything in the Egyptian religious framework was real, consequential, immediate, affecting the actual fate of an actual person. This is where Anubis becomes something more specific than a guardian or a guide. He was the guarantor of the process itself. His presence in the embalming ritual was not only about his divine authority over the space, it was about his role as the one who ensured that nothing was done wrong, that the sequence was followed, that the materials were correct, that the prayers were spoken as they needed to be spoken, that the body was handled with the care and precision that its future journey required. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, the overseer. Consider what that means in practical terms for the family outside the Pernefa. They were not present for the process. They could not watch to make sure everything was done correctly. They had to trust, and trust is always easier when there is someone specific to trust, someone whose entire existence is oriented toward the thing you need done right. Anubis was that someone, not a human priest who might make mistakes, who might have an off day, who might be tired or distracted or insufficiently trained. The god whose mythology established him as the one who had done this first, who had invented the process, who had refined it to the point where it worked, who stood over every subsequent performance of it as the standard against which that performance was measured. When you left your dead in the care of the priests of Anubis, you were leaving them with the god who had the most invested in the process going correctly, because the process was his. There is another dimension to this that is easy to overlook. The fear of the ritual failing was not only about the outcome for the dead person, it was about the outcome for the living ones. If the preservation failed, if the journey through the Duat went wrong, if the person you loved did not make it through the weighing of the heart and into the field of reeds, where the blessed dead continued their existence, then everything the family had done, everything they had sacrificed to afford the embalming and the tomb and the grave goods and the ongoing offerings, had not been enough. The guilt of that, in a system where you genuinely believed that the quality of your preparation determined the fate of your dead, would be devastating. Anubis protected the living from that guilt by being the one who made the ritual work, by being the guarantee that if you did your part, if you brought your dead to the right people and gave them what they needed and maintained the offerings as you were supposed to, then what happened next was in the hands of a god who did not fail. He was not only standing between the dead and erasure, he was standing between the grieving and the unbearable weight of wondering if they had done enough. That is a god who understands human beings, not just the dead ones, the ones left behind, and in every culture and every century where grief has existed. The people left behind have always needed someone to tell them that what they did was sufficient, that their love, expressed in the forms available to them, was enough to protect the one they lost. Anubis, in the world that built him, was that assurance made divine. The ritual did not fail because he was there, and he was always there. Before we go any further into what Anubis did, we need to spend a moment on who he was. And that requires saying something honestly about the nature of Egyptian mythology that most retellings skip over in their eagerness to get to the dramatic parts. Egyptian myth is not like Greek myth. It does not come to us as a single coherent narrative. A story told by one author in one place at one time that we can point to and say, this is the source. What we have instead are fragments, texts carved into tomb walls across thousands of years, spells written on papyrus in different cities by different priests in different centuries, each reflecting the religious priorities and local traditions of the time and place that produced them. The family of Osiris, the family that Anubis orbits, comes to us through all of those layers. Different texts give different accounts. Different traditions emphasize different relationships. The origins of Anubis himself are among the more complex questions in Egyptology, with the earliest texts describing his parentage in ways that differ from later accounts. This is important to say, not because it makes the mythology less interesting, but because it makes it more honest. We are dealing with the living religious imagination of a civilization that lasted for 3,000 years. Of course, it is complicated. Of course, there are contradictions. That is what it looks like when real people grapple with real questions over real time. So when we follow one particular tradition here, the tradition that gives Anubis a specific place in the family of Osiris, we are following the thread that carries the most emotional weight, the thread that helps us understand who Anubis was in the deepest sense. But we are following one thread among several, and knowing that makes the thread more valuable, not less. In this tradition, preserved primarily through later sources, including writers from the Greek and Roman periods who documented what they understood of Egyptian belief, the family at the center of everything looks like this: Osiris, the good king, the just ruler, the god who taught civilization to the people of Egypt and governed with a wisdom that made his reign feel like the world was working as it was supposed to. He was married to Isis, his sister in the divine sense, the goddess of magic and restoration, whose love for Osiris would eventually drive her to do things that no one had ever done before and would not do again. Set was Osiris's brother. He was the god of the desert, of storms, of the disrupting and chaotic forces that exist at the edges of ordered things. He was not straightforwardly evil in the earliest layers of Egyptian religion. He was necessary, the way that storms are necessary, the way that the desert itself is necessary, as the boundary that defines the green world by being its opposite. But in the mythology that has come down to us most completely, Set was the one who could not accept that his brother's light made him stand in shadow. Nephthys was Set's wife, sister to both Osiris and Isis, a goddess of the edges, of the liminal spaces, of the threshold between life and death, which perhaps explains something about the child she carried. The story, in this tradition, is that one night, through circumstances the ancient sources treat with the delicacy that such things tend to receive, Nephthys came to Osiris as if she were Isis. What followed produced a child. Nephthys was terrified of what Set would do if he found out. So when the child was born, she did what people who are terrified do. She made the fear into action, and the action into distance. She abandoned the infant in the marshes, in the dense papyrus growth along the edge of the Nile, and walked away. Isis found the child. Isis, wife of the man whose encounter with Nephthys had produced this child, took the abandoned infant and raised him as her own. The child was Anubis. The sources do not give us the private conversation between Osiris and the son who, in this tradition, carries his blood. That silence is exactly where the story lives. We do not know what Osiris understood about who Anubis was, or what Anubis understood about where he came from, or how either of them navigated the space between what was known and what was said. What we know is what happened later. What we know is what Anubis did when the moment came that defined his entire existence. He grew up at the edges, raised by Isis, his father's wife, in a family whose shape had been complicated before he was born by forces none of them had chosen. He became the god of the boundary between living and dead. He became the guardian of the embalming ritual. He became the one who stood at the threshold that everyone had to cross and made sure that the crossing could be made. He was born at the margin, and he made the margin his home. And when the great crisis came, when the family at the center of everything shattered in the way that families sometimes shatter, when Set did the thing that Set had been building toward, Anubis was the one who showed up, not with an army, not with a counterattack, not with any of the responses that the mythology of divine power usually reaches for when the order of things is violated. He showed up with the knowledge of how to keep a body from becoming nothing, and in the world where everything that mattered depended on the body surviving. That turned out to be exactly enough. But before we get to what Anubis did, we have to understand what Set did first. We have to understand the murder that was designed not just to kill a god, but to make him disappear entirely, because that is the crime that everything else is a response to. And it is one of the most carefully constructed acts of erasure in the history of human storytelling. Set did not lose his temper. That is the first thing to understand about what he did, and it is the detail that makes the whole story colder and more disturbing than a crime of passion would ever be. He did not snap one day in a moment of jealousy and do something he could not take back. He planned. He thought it through. He took his time. He measured his brother. The ancient sources tell us that Set had a chest made, a beautiful chest, elaborate and decorated, the kind of object that would draw attention at a feast, the kind of gift that would make people stop their conversations and look. He had it made to specific dimensions that he knew, because he had taken care to find out, would fit one person exactly, his brother. The feast was Set's occasion. He was the host, which meant he controlled the room, the timing, the sequence of events. At some point in the evening, when the wine had been poured enough times, and the mood was expansive, and the guests were in the kind of good spirits that make people willing to play along with something that might otherwise seem strange, Set brought out the chest. He proposed a game. Whoever could fit perfectly inside the chest could keep it. A generous gift from a generous host. Guest after guest climbed in. No one fit. The chest was always slightly too long or slightly too wide, or the dimensions were simply wrong for whoever was trying. Set watched each attempt with the patience of a man who already knew how the game ended. Then Osiris got in. The lid came down. Set sealed it. Lead poured into the seams, filling every gap, making the chest airtight, making it permanent. Then the chest went into the Nile, carried out by Set's people in the dark, set on the current, pushed away from the bank and released. Osiris did not die quickly. He died in the dark, in a sealed space fitted exactly to his body, with no air and no light and no way out and no one coming. He died alone in a box his brother had made for him, and the box went down the river and out to sea. There was no body to find, no site of death to grieve at, no remains to perform the rites over, no location where the family could stand and say, "Here, this is where it happened. This is where we begin the process of what comes next." Set had not just killed his brother, he had engineered a disappearance. The chest eventually came to rest far from Egypt, carried by currents to the coast of a place called Byblos, in what is now Lebanon. A tree grew around it, incorporating it into its trunk, swallowing it whole. A king of Byblos had the tree cut down and made into a pillar for his palace. not knowing what was inside it, not knowing that the architecture of his home now contained a god. Isis found out. Isis always found out. She traveled to Byblos. She worked her way into the household of the king. And eventually she was alone with the pillar, and she took the chest out of the tree and she brought Osiris home. For a moment, there was something to work with. A body, intact, that had survived inside the sealed chest. A body that Isis brought back to Egypt and hid in the marshes while she figured out what to do next. Set found it. What he did then is the part of the story that goes beyond ordinary cruelty into something that can only be understood as a systematic attempt to make resurrection impossible. He dismembered the body, cut it apart into pieces, and scattered those pieces across Egypt. Different versions of the story give different numbers, but the number is almost beside the point. The point is the geography. The pieces were not left in one place. They were distributed across the length of a country that stretched hundreds of miles along the Nile. Each piece in a different location. Each piece separated from the others by distances that would take weeks to travel. Stand back and look at what Set actually did here. He did not just want Osiris dead. He had achieved that already with the chest. He wanted Osiris to be impossible to reassemble, to be so thoroughly dispersed that the necessary wholeness for embalming, for burial, for the rituals that opened the door to continued existence, could never be achieved. He had studied the Egyptian system of death and afterlife carefully enough to know exactly where it was vulnerable. The whole system depended on the body, on its integrity, on its presence in one place where the right things could be done to it. Take the body apart and scatter it across a country, and you do not just kill someone. You engineer the impossibility of their survival. Set knew what he was doing. He was not committing murder. He was committing erasure. He was using the Egyptian understanding of death as a weapon against the most central figure in Egyptian divine life, exploiting the very belief system that was supposed to protect people from exactly this outcome. The genius of it, if that word can be applied to something this calculated and this cold, is that it turned the Egyptian system against itself. The system said, preserve the body and the person can continue. Set said, what if the body cannot be preserved because the body no longer exists as a body? Isis and Nephthys went looking, together, the wife and the sister wife, the two women whose lives had been tangled together by Osiris in different ways, whose relationship to each other and to him was complicated in every direction, went out across Egypt and started finding pieces. This took time. This took everything. This was not a search you could conduct from one location or complete in a season. This was the work of grief made into action. The refusal to accept what Set had decided was final, expressed as the most exhausting and most necessary thing that could possibly be done. They found most of the pieces, not all of them. One piece was gone permanently, taken by the Nile, consumed, lost in the water that had also carried Osiris away in the chest at the beginning. Different versions of the mythology handle this loss in different ways. But in most of them, Isis worked around the missing part with her considerable magical abilities, reconstructing what she could not find, and when they had assembled what could be assembled, when they had gathered the pieces of a god from across the length of Egypt and brought them together in one place, they had something that looked like a body, but it was not yet a body in the sense that mattered. It was pieces, arranged, held together by grief and determination and the magic that Isis carried in her hands, for it to be a body, for it to be the kind of body that could serve as the anchor for everything the Egyptian system promised, for it to be the body that would one day allow Osiris to rise and take his place as the king of the dead and the god of resurrection. It needed something that neither Isis nor Nephthys had. It needed the one thing that could turn pieces back into a person. It needed the art that had never been practiced before, because it had never been necessary before, because no one had ever needed it before. It needed Anubis, and Anubis came, not because he was summoned, not because it was his assignment in a divine bureaucracy. The mythology does not give us a scene where a god sends a messenger and Anubis receives instructions and follows orders. He came because he understood what was needed. He came because he was the only one who could provide it, and he came to the body of the Father who, in this tradition, had never publicly claimed him, to do the most intimate and most sacred thing that existed in the Egyptian world, to take what death and Set and dispersal had done to a person and refuse, with his hands and his knowledge and his authority over the threshold between ending and continuing, to let it stand. There is a moment in the Osiris myth that the ancient texts circle around rather than describe directly, the moment when Isis understood what Set had done, not the murder itself. She had known about the murder. She had found the chest, travelled to Byblos, brought her husband home. She had held, briefly, the possibility of something that was not quite restoration but was at least a beginning. She had come back from the edges of the known world with a body, and then she did not have a body anymore. The ancient sources do not dwell on that moment. They tend to move through it quickly, to get from the discovery to the search, from the loss to the action, because the mythology is interested in what Isis does and not in what she feels in the seconds before she decides to do it. But the feeling is there. In the gap between one sentence and the next, she had carried him home from Byblos. She had crossed the sea and navigated a foreign court and dismantled a pillar in a palace and carried the chest back to Egypt with her own hands. She had done all of that. And Set had found out. And Set had done what Set did when winning the first time was not enough, and he needed to make the winning permanent. What Isis felt in that moment is not recorded. What she did is, she went looking, together with Nephthys, her sister, Set's wife, the woman whose choices had added their own layer of complication to everything. The two of them went out into Egypt and started finding pieces. Think about what that actually required. Egypt is not a small country. The Nile stretches for hundreds of miles through the landscape, and the civilization built along it was strung across that length like beads on a cord. City after village after settlement, each with its own character and its own local traditions and its own relationship to the religious practices that ran through everything. Set had used that geography deliberately. He had not left the pieces close together where a determined search might find them all in a season. He had spread them across the full extent of the world that Osiris had governed, so that finding them all would require going everywhere, touching every part of the kingdom, coming face to face with every place that had known Osiris as king and now knew him as something scattered and seemingly irretrievable. And Isis went to all of it. There is a tradition that says a temple or a sacred site arose at each place where a piece of Osiris was found, which means that if you were to map the search of Isis across the landscape of ancient Egypt, you would be mapping the sacred geography of the country itself. The myth and the land are the same thing in this tradition. The places that mattered most, the places where people came for generations to worship and to grieve and to ask for divine help with their own losses, were the places where the most broken god in the mythology had been put back together, piece by someone who refused to stop. Each piece found was a refusal. That is the word for what Isis was doing. Not rescue. Exactly. Not retrieval in the neutral sense. Each piece of Osiris that she and Nephthys lifted from wherever Set had left it and carried with them was an act of refusal. A refusal of the premise that what Set had done was final. A refusal of the idea that dispersal was the same as disappearance. That if you spread something far enough across the world, it ceased to exist as itself. She was insisting, through action, that the pieces were still one thing, still Osiris, still the specific person whose name she knew and whose weight in her arms she could still feel from Byblos, whose face she had seen every day of her divine existence before the chest and the river and the scattering made that daily fact impossible. And Nephthys was there for all of it, This is the part of the story that tends to get less attention than it deserves, because it is easier to focus on Isis and Osiris as the central relationship, the love story that drives the search, the marriage that Set's crime violated. But Nephthys was there. Set's own wife went out with the wife of the man her husband had murdered and helped put him back together. What Nephthys carried into that search was complicated in ways the mythology does not fully unpack. Guilt, perhaps. Responsibility, perhaps, in the sense that the events of a night she had not planned had contributed to the chain of consequences that ended here. Love for her sister. A moral sense that what Set had done was wrong in ways that superseded whatever obligations marriage created. She went. She helped. She carried pieces of Osiris alongside Isis across the length of Egypt, and when they had found what could be found, when they had gathered as much of him as existed to be gathered, they had an assembled thing that was also an impossible problem. A body made of pieces is not a mummified body. It is not preserved. It is not prepared. It is not the kind of body that the Egyptian system of death and afterlife could work with, because the Egyptian system required a body that was intact and treated and wrapped and protected and anchored. What Isis and Nephthys had was the raw material for that. What they needed was someone who knew what to do with raw material. What they needed was the knowledge of how to take something broken and make it into something that could hold. Anubis brought that knowledge with him when he came. He brought the oils and the natron and the linen and the understanding of the process that he would use to create the first mummy in the history of the world. He brought the skill and the authority and the presence of the god who presided over exactly this kind of threshold. The moment when what had been destroyed was being asked to become the foundation for what came next. But there is something else he brought that is harder to name and more important to understand. He brought the willingness. Nobody required Anubis to do what he did for Osiris. There is no text that presents this as an obligation, a divine assignment handed down from above. In the tradition where Osiris is his father, the relationship between them had no public acknowledgement, no established bond that would create an obvious claim on Anubis's loyalty or his service. He came anyway. He came to the assembled pieces of a god who, in this tradition, had never spoken his name in public, and he did the most painstaking and most sacred work of his existence on behalf of that god. He took what Set had tried to make permanently broken, and he made it into something that could continue. Some things are simply what they are. Some people show up when they are needed. Not because anyone required it of them, but because showing up is the only response they have to the situation in front of them. Anubis showed up. And what happened next? What he did with the pieces that Isis and Nephthys had carried across Egypt changed everything. Not just for Osiris, for every person who would ever die in Egypt for the next 3,000 years. There is no dramatic entrance in the mythology, no thunderclap, no divine light descending from above, no moment where the heavens open and announce that something unprecedented is about to happen. Anubis simply arrives, and that quietness, that lack of spectacle around the most consequential act in the entire Egyptian understanding of death and afterlife, is itself a kind of meaning. The mythology is telling you something about what this moment is made of. Not power displayed, not glory claimed, just a god who knows what needs to be done, arriving at the place where it needs to be done, and beginning. Isis and Nephthys had assembled the pieces of Osiris on a clean surface, in a sheltered place, away from the river and the wind and everything that would accelerate the process that was already underway. What they had laid out in front of them was both clearly Osiris and clearly not the Osiris that either of them had known. The shape was there. The face was there. Or most of it. The specific architecture of the person. The physical form that had moved through the world and sat at the head of divine councils and been the husband and the brother and the king, was present in the way that a word is present when you can see all the letters, but they are not yet in the right order. Anubis looked at what was in front of him. The mythology does not tell us what that moment felt like from the inside. It does not give us access to whatever Anubis carried into that space. Whatever he understood about his relationship to the figure lying there. Whatever history existed between them in the silence that the sources do not fill. The ancient texts are interested in the action, not the interior. They move through feeling toward consequence, because consequence is what the ritual requires. But the silence in the sources is not the same as the absence of something. He knelt down and began. What he did, over the hours and days that followed, was something that had never been done before. There was no precedent, no established procedure handed down from an earlier generation of divine embalmers who had faced this situation and worked out the right approach. Anubis was not following a protocol. He was inventing one, in real time, in response to a situation that the world had not previously produced. He cleaned the pieces with the care of someone who understood that the cleaning was not preparatory to the important work. The cleaning was the important work. Every action taken on the body was part of the ritual, and the ritual extended from the first touch to the last wrapping, without gaps, without moments when the divine attention stepped back and allowed ordinary physical reality to operate unchecked. He treated the surfaces with oils and resins, cheddar, myrrh, materials that had their own sacred properties, their own relationships to preservation and to the divine, their own role in the larger architecture of what was being built. Each material chosen for a reason, each reason connected to a theology that understood the body as a sacred object requiring sacred materials. He worked through the night. The ancient Egyptians imagined that the sun traveled through the duat each night and emerged reborn each morning. The night was not empty time. It was the time of transformation, the period when the most significant changes happened, when the movement from one state to another took place in the darkness that preceded the return of the light. Anubis worked in the dark, doing what he had come to do, while the rest of the divine world continued in whatever way it continued, while Isis held her grief and her hope in the same hands and waited, while Nephthys stayed nearby in the way that people stay nearby when they cannot help but cannot leave, while somewhere Set was living in the confidence of a man who believed he had made something permanent. He had not made it permanent. Anubis was making sure of that. The wrapping was the final stage. Hundreds of yards of clean white linen, wound with the specific intention and the specific pattern that transformed a body into a mummy, that completed the conversion of what had been a living person into something that could endure. The wrapping was not decoration, and it was not concealment. It was the final layer of protection, the outer boundary of a preserved thing, the last statement that this body would hold its shape against the forces that had already tried once to take it apart. When it was done, Osiris was a mummy. He was the first mummy, the original instance of the practice that would be performed on every Egyptian who could afford it, and many who could barely afford it. For the next 3,000 years, the model against which every subsequent embalming was measured, the proof of concept that made the entire Egyptian afterlife system possible. Anubis did not invent the hope of an afterlife. The ancient Egyptians had been thinking about what came after death long before this moment in the mythology. But what he did on that night, working alone in the dark with oils and linen and the knowledge that no one else possessed, was give that hope a body to live in. Because the Egyptian hope for afterlife was not abstract. It required a specific physical foundation. It required a body that was intact, preserved, present, and protected. Without that, the Ka had nowhere to go. The Ba had no anchor. The whole beautiful and elaborate system of continued existence that the Egyptians had constructed required, as its foundation, a body that would not disappear. Osiris had almost disappeared. Set had designed the disappearance carefully, had worked to make it permanent. had scattered the possibility of preservation across the length of a country so that reassembly would be impossible and embalming would have nothing to work with. Anubis worked with what there was, and at the end of his work, the foundation existed. The body was there, preserved and whole, capable of serving as the anchor for everything the Egyptian system promised. The car had a home. The bar had a place to return. The name had a form to attach to. Osiris could continue. The mythology does not pause here to reflect on what Anubis felt when it was finished. It does not give us a scene where he stands back and looks at what he has created and allows himself a moment of something, but think about it from the outside. He had come to the assembled pieces of a god who was, in this tradition, his father. He had performed on that body the first instance of the most sacred practice in Egyptian death religion. He had done it without being asked, without being required, without any publicly acknowledged relationship that would explain or justify the depth of what he brought to the work. And when he was done, he had given the entire Egyptian hope for life after death, the physical foundation it needed to be more than a hope. He had made it possible, not by being powerful in the way that Set was powerful, not by taking things apart and scattering them, by putting things back together, by knowing how to take what death had done and refuse to let it be the last word. That is what Anubis brought to the world. Not protection from death, the possibility of surviving it. Most of us, if we are being honest, experience a funeral as an ending. The rituals of modern Western death culture are built around conclusion. The gathering happens. The words are spoken. The body is committed to the ground or to the fire. And then, the people who loved the person who died have to figure out how to live in a world that has been permanently altered by an absence that will not stop being present. The funeral is where we say goodbye. The ancient Egyptians did not build their funerary culture around goodbye. They built it around departure. These are different things. Goodbye is final in a way that departure is not. When someone departs, there is a journey implied, a destination, a trajectory that continues beyond the moment of leaving, even if you cannot see it from where you are standing. When someone departs, the correct response is not grief at an ending, but preparation for a journey. The kind of careful, practical, thorough preparation that you give to someone you love who is about to go somewhere that you cannot follow, somewhere dangerous and unfamiliar and far from everything they know. The funeral in ancient Egypt was that preparation made visible and communal. It was the moment when the family and the priests and the community gathered to do everything in their power to make sure that the person departing had everything they needed for what came next. Not just the embalmed body, though that was the foundation. Not just the tomb, though that was the anchor. Everything. Food, water, tools, furniture, clothing, amulets with specific protective properties for specific dangers, texts with specific spells for specific encounters, objects that the dead person had used in life and would know how to use in death. The Duat, the realm through which the dead traveled on their way to judgment, and to whatever lay beyond judgment, was a place with real geography in the Egyptian imagination. It had landscape. It had roads and rivers and lakes. It had gates. Many gates, each guarded by figures that would demand specific things from the person trying to pass. Names, passwords, proof of identity and worthiness, demonstrations that the traveler knew the terrain they were moving through and had the right to be there. You could not navigate that terrain without preparation, which meant that the quality of the preparation, the thoroughness of the packing, the completeness of the grave goods, the skill of the priests who composed and copied the spells that the dead person would need, mattered in the most immediate and practical sense. This was not piety. This was logistics. Think about what that implies for how the ancient Egyptians thought about death. In a worldview where the funeral is goodbye, there is very little that the living can do for the dead once the ceremony is over. You grieve. You remember. You carry the loss forward. But the dead person is gone, and whatever happens to them now is outside your reach. In a worldview where the funeral is a departure ceremony, the living have enormous power and enormous responsibility. What you put in that tomb, what spells you copied, what offerings you maintained, what care you took in every step of the preparation, directly affected the journey of the person you were sending off. You were not helpless. You were essential. The ancient Egyptians were not consoled about death. They were given something to do about it, and Anubis was at the center of every step of the doing. He was there in the embalming room, presiding over the preservation of the body that would serve as the anchor for everything else. He was there in the wrapping, in the placement of the amulets, in the performance of the rituals that transformed a body into a protected and prepared traveler. He was there at the entrance to the tomb, at the moment of crossing from the world of the living into the sealed darkness, where the journey would begin in earnest. And he was there, waiting, on the other side of that threshold. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed at the entrance to the tomb on the day of burial, was one of the most important rituals in the entire Egyptian funerary tradition. Its purpose was to restore to the mummified body the ability to speak, to breathe, to eat, to use the senses that the process of death and mummification had taken away. It was a ritual reactivation, a ceremonial undoing of death's most immediate effects, performed so that the dead person could function in the afterlife as a complete and capable being. Anubis presided over that threshold. The moment when the family stepped back and the tomb was sealed was not the moment when their connection to the dead person ended. It was the moment when their active role changed. The ongoing offerings, the food and drink left at the tomb entrance, the prayers spoken at regular intervals, the maintenance of the name through inscription and through speaking, continued the relationship between the living and the dead in a form that the Egyptian system recognized and required. The dead needed the living to keep them alive. Not alive in the biological sense, alive in the sense of present, named, fed, remembered, connected to the world they had left in ways that prevented the worst form of erasure, the gradual forgetting that turns a specific person into a general absence, and then into nothing at all. The funeral launched a journey. The journey required a guide, and the guide was already waiting at the first gate, on the other side of the sealed stone, in the darkness at the beginning of the road through the Duat, ready to take the hand of someone who had never been this way before and needed, more than anything, not to be alone. That is what it meant, in ancient Egypt, for the funeral to be over. It meant the real work was just beginning, and the real work had a god assigned to it, who had been doing it since before the first human being was buried in the sand at the edge of the green world. Long before anyone thought to give that work a name, or carve the name of the one who did it onto the walls of the rooms where the dead were prepared for what came next. The family walked back toward the river. Behind them, the stone was sealed, ahead of the person they had just buried. On a road none of them could see from where they stood. A figure with the head of a jackal was waiting. He had been waiting since before they arrived. He would be waiting for all of them. Eventually, he was in no hurry. The dead had all the time they needed, and Anubis had all the time in the world. Picture a scroll of papyrus being placed into a pair of hands that will never open it. The hands belong to a woman named Neferenpet, a singer in the temple of Ammon at Thebes, who died sometime around 1200 years before the Common Era. The scroll placed with her in the tomb was prepared specifically for her, commissioned by her family, copied by a scribe who wrote her name into the spells at the places where a name needed to go. It was not a generic document. It was a personal one, as specific to her as the furniture in her house and the jewelry around her neck. It was her manual for what came next. We call it the Book of the Dead, which is a name that was given to it by a 19th century German Egyptologist and has stuck ever since, despite being not quite right in almost every sense. It is not one book. It is not fixed in its contents. And, while it is certainly concerned with the dead, its purpose is not to describe death, but to help the dead person navigate successfully past it. The British Museum holds one of the most famous examples, the Papyrus of Hunefer, created for a royal scribe who served under the pharaoh Seti I, around 1270 years before the Common Era. It is illustrated in extraordinary detail, the figures painted with a precision and care that tells you everything about how seriously the people who made it took the purpose it was meant to serve. This was not decorative. This was functional. Every image and every word in that papyrus was there because it would do something specific for the person it was made for. What we call the Book of the Dead is better understood as a collection of spells, what the ancient Egyptians called spells for going out by day, assembled from a tradition of funerary literature that stretched back across more than 1,000 years before any given version was written down. The form most familiar to us, including the famous scenes of the weighing of the heart, comes primarily from the New Kingdom period and later manuscripts, organized around what Egyptologists catalogue as Spell 125, the declaration of innocence before the gods of the Hall of Two Truths. No two copies of this collection are exactly alike. That fact is more important than it might initially appear. In a religious tradition where the afterlife journey was understood as a specific and dangerous road through specific terrain, requiring specific knowledge to navigate, the manual for that journey was not standardized. It was curated. A family or an individual worked with a scribe or with a temple to assemble the particular combination of spells and instructions and images that they believed would serve their dead person best. Some combinations were more common than others. Some spells appeared in almost every version because they were understood as essential. Others were optional, included because of individual circumstance or personal religious preference, or simply because the family could afford to pay for more pages and wanted their loved one to be as thoroughly protected as possible. The resulting document was as individual as the person it was made for, and this individuality reveals something about the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife that a standardized text would conceal. The journey through the Duat was not generic. It was personal. The preparation for that journey had to be tailored to the traveler. But here is the detail that sits uncomfortably alongside the theology. The quality of your preparation depended heavily on your resources. The afterlife was imagined as universal in hope, but not equal in preparation. A wealthy person could commission a long, beautifully illustrated papyrus, hand-copied by the most skilled scribes in the most important temples, with every relevant spell included and every image painted in full color with gold leaf details. A person of moderate means might have a shorter version, with fewer spells and simpler illustrations, still functional but less comprehensive. A person at the lower end of the economic scale might have only a few spells written on a small piece of papyrus, the minimum that a caring family could afford to provide. The ancient Egyptians did not seem to experience this as a contradiction. Or if they did, the texts do not preserve the discomfort. The system that was supposed to guarantee the possibility of continued existence for every person was also a system that rewarded wealth in the most consequential arena imaginable. What remained constant, regardless of the length of the scroll, or the quality of the illustrations, or the number of spells included, was the presence of Anubis in the journey. He does not appear in every spell. Not every page of every version of this collection invokes his name or depicts his image, but wherever the journey touches on the body, the road, the tomb, the threshold, or the moment of judgment that waits at the end of the road, his presence is implied by the very nature of what is happening. He is the one who presided over the body that the spells assume was properly preserved. He is the one who knows the road that the spells are helping the traveler navigate. He is the one whose authority makes the judgment that waits at the end of the road possible and fair. You could fill a scroll with every spell ever written for the journey through the Duat and not mention his name on a single page. He would still be in every word of it, because the journey the scroll was preparing its owner to take was a journey through his domain. Along roads, he knew. Toward a judgment he helped administer. In a world whose entire structure he had helped establish, on the morning he knelt beside the assembled pieces of Osiris and refused to let a god be erased. The scroll in Neferenpet's hands was her preparation. Anubis was her guide. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient without the other, and somewhere between the words written by the scribe, who had copied her name into the spells, and the figure waiting at the threshold of the Duat, with the knowledge of every road and every gate and every guardian that stood between her and the Hall of Two Truths. Neferenpet had what she needed to attempt the journey. Whether the heart she carried was light enough when she arrived was a different question entirely. That answer, no scroll could provide. That answer lived in the weight of every choice she had made while she was still alive to make choices, and the scale that would measure that weight was already set up and waiting. Anubis was already kneeling beside it, as he had been since before Neferenpet was born, as he would be long after the papyrus that carried her name had turned to dust. Look at the papyrus of Hunefer. If you visit the British Museum in London, you can see it in person. A strip of painted papyrus, more than 3,000 years old. The colors still present in a way that feels impossible, given everything that 3,000 years usually does to fragile things. If you cannot make it to London, photographs of it exist in every serious book about ancient Egyptian religion, and the image is striking enough that once you have seen it, you tend to remember it. One of the scenes on this papyrus shows a moment that is easy to overlook if you are focused on the more dramatic elements surrounding it. Anubis is leading Hunefer by the hand, not carrying him, not pointing from a distance toward a door and indicating that Hunefer should proceed in that direction when he is ready. Leading him, the two figures are in motion together, moving toward the Hall of Two Truths. And the physical connection between them is deliberate and specific, a hand extended, a hand taken, the gesture that in every culture and every century means the same thing. I am here. Come with me. I know the way. Hold that image for a moment, because it cuts against almost everything that modern popular culture has built around the figure of Anubis, in movies and television and video games. Anubis tends to appear as a figure of power and distance. He stands above things. He commands. He judges. He is impressive in the way that divine authority is impressive, which is to say that he is large and remote and invested in his own significance. He is someone you might fear or admire or try to placate, but he is not someone who takes your hand. The ancient Egyptians drew him taking your hand. This is not a small distinction. Every culture that has built mythology around the journey of the dead has imagined some figure whose role is to facilitate that journey. The Greeks had Hermes, the messenger god, who guided souls from the world of the living to the entrance of the underworld. He was efficient and businesslike about it. A professional doing a job, moving souls from one location to another, the way a ferry operator moves passengers, without particular investment in the individuals being transported. The Greeks also had Charon, the ferryman, who rowed the dead across the river Styx. Charon required payment, the coin placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the dead person so that they could pay the fare. He was not cruel, but he was transactional. The relationship between Charon and the soul he carried lasted exactly as long as the river crossing and ended the moment they reached the other bank. The Norse tradition gave us the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, who selected warriors on the battlefield and carried them to Valhalla. They were magnificent and terrifying, divine women on horseback, moving through the chaos of battle. But their role was selection and transport. They chose, they carried, they deposited the chosen in Valhalla and returned to the battlefield for the next engagement. Anubis is doing something different from all of them. He is not transporting Hunefer from one place to another and then withdrawing. He is walking beside him, at the same pace, in the same direction, holding his hand through the approach to the most consequential moment of Hunefer's existence. He has been with Hunefer since the embalming table. He will be with him through the gate and into the hall, and to the moment when the scale is balanced and the result is known. In Egyptian funerary imagination, Anubis is not simply transport. He is preparation, protection, and presence through the whole of the journey. The ancient Egyptians understood, in the way that people understand things about what they most need before they can articulate why they need it, that this was the quality most required in a guide through the territory of death. Not power, not knowledge alone, not authority over the destination. Presence, continued, reliable presence, because the terror of death, underneath all the specific cultural forms it takes and all the specific theological answers different civilizations have constructed in response to it, has always included this element, the fear of being alone in it, not just dead, but alone in dying, not just gone, but gone without anyone to accompany the going, the sealed darkness of the tomb, the road through the Dua with its gates and its guardians and its dangers, the approach to the hall where everything would be decided. All of it was more survivable in the Egyptian imagination, because you did not make that approach alone. Anubis was there. He knew the road, because it was his road. He knew the guardians at the gates, because the gates were in his domain. He knew what each encounter required because he had been present for every version of this journey that had ever been made. Going back to the first one, going back to the moment when he himself had established what the journey could look like by making it possible for the first traveler to attempt it at all. He knew the way, and at least in this image, and in the ritual imagination, it represents. He held your hand while he showed it to you. That gesture, that extended hand in the papyrus of Hunefer, is one of the most human things in the entire Egyptian mythological tradition, and it appears in the image of a figure with the head of an animal. The ancient Egyptians put the most human gesture they could imagine onto the god they had given the least human face, because the god they needed at that particular threshold, at that particular moment, at the approach to everything that the afterlife required of a person, was not the kind of God who stands at a distance and judges. It was the kind of God who knows what you are feeling and reaches out anyway and says, without any words at all, that you do not have to do this alone. Hunefer was not alone, and neither, the ancient Egyptians promised, were you. The hand of Anubis was already extended. It had always been extended. Every person who died in ancient Egypt, from the greatest pharaoh in the most elaborate tomb to the poorest farmer in the simplest grave, was making the same journey toward the same destination along the same road, and the same figure was waiting at the beginning of it. Hand out, eyes forward, knowing the way. There is a room at the end of the road, through the Duat. Every road through the Duat leads to it eventually. Regardless of which gates you pass through, or which guardians you convinced, or which spells you used to get past the dangers that lined the path. All of it, every step of the journey, every amulet placed in the wrappings, and every word written in the scroll, and every offering left at the tomb entrance by the people who loved you, was preparation for arriving at this room. The ancient Egyptians called it the Hall of Two Truths. Walk in. The ceiling is high. The light comes from everywhere and nowhere. The kind of even, sourceless illumination that exists in spaces where ordinary physics have been suspended in favor of something more absolute. There is no shadow in this room that you can hide behind. There is no corner where the light does not reach. Every surface is visible. Every face is clear. Every figure in the room can see every other figure without obstruction or ambiguity. Along the walls, 42 figures are seated, 42 gods, each representing one of the 42 nomes, the administrative regions of ancient Egypt. They are not there as observers. They are there as a jury. The assembled authority of the entire Egyptian world made present in a single room for the single purpose of witnessing what is about to happen to you. Thoth stands to one side, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, with a palette and a reed pen ready. He is not participating in the judgment. He is recording it. Whatever happens in this room, whatever the scale reveals, whatever the assembled gods witness, Thoth will write it down in the permanent record that the Egyptian universe maintains of every life that has passed through it. Across the room, seated on a throne that communicates authority in every line of its construction, is Osiris, green-skinned, wrapped in the white linen of the dead, wearing the double crown of Egypt. He is the king of the dead, the lord of the afterlife, the god whose own passage through death and embalming and resurrection established the possibility of the journey you have just completed. He is the destination, the one before whom everything in this room is ultimately being performed. And in the center of the room, between the jury and the throne, between the walls of watching gods and the seated king, is the scale. It is a balanced scale, 2 pans suspended from a central beam, precise in its construction, in the way that instruments of measurement need to be precise, when what is being measured matters absolutely. On one pan, a feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess whose name means truth and order and justice and the right way that things should be. Ma'at is not simply a concept in the Egyptian theological framework. She is a divine force, the principle that holds the universe in its correct configuration. The reason that the sun rises every morning, and the Nile floods every year, and the stars remain in their patterns, and the living world does not simply collapse into chaos. Her feather is the lightest thing that exists, not because feathers are light in some poetic sense, but because Ma'at, in her purest form, has no weight at all. She is what is, rather than what has accumulated on top of what is. On the other pan, your heart, before the scale is set, before the moment of measurement arrives, you must stand before the 42 gods and speak. The Declaration of Innocence is what scholars call it, the series of statements that the dead person makes before each of the assembled judges. The form we know best comes from the tradition of funerary texts developed during the New Kingdom and later periods of Egyptian history, where it appears as part of the great body of spells and instructions for the afterlife journey. In these texts, the dead person addresses each divine judge in turn. I have not caused pain. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not caused the scales to be tampered with. I have not turned away from words of truth. I have not taken the milk from the mouths of children. I have not driven away the animals from their pastures. 42 statements. 42 judges. The dead person must stand in front of each one and declare their innocence before that judge's specific domain of concern. The breadth of the declarations is striking. They cover violence and theft and dishonesty, which you might expect, but they also cover environmental harm, economic exploitation, neglect of the vulnerable, manipulation of legal processes, cruelty to animals. The system of moral accounting that the ancient Egyptians built was not narrow. It was comprehensive in a way that reflects a civilization that had thought carefully about all the ways that a person could damage the world and the people in it. Notice what the declarations do not include. They do not ask about wealth. They do not ask about status or reputation or how many people mourned at your funeral. They do not ask whether you were important. They ask about behavior, about what you did and did not do in your relationships with other people, with animals, with the world you moved through. The ancient Egyptian system of moral judgment was not interested in who you were. It was interested in how you acted, and the 42 judges have been listening to declarations like yours for longer than you can comprehend. They have heard every possible version of a human life pass through this room. They know what truth sounds like, and they know what it sounds like when someone is saying the words but not carrying them. Your heart knows too. That is the part of the system that has no simple exit. You can say anything in front of the 42 judges. You can compose your declarations with care and deliver them with conviction. You can have practiced them, memorized them from the scroll your family placed in your hands, recited them to yourself on the long road through the duat so that you would know them perfectly when the moment arrived. The heart carries what the heart carries. It is not a document you can revise before the judgment. It is not a record that can be edited or expunged or reframed. It is the actual moral accumulation of the actual life you lived, compressed into the organ that the ancient Egyptians understood as the seat of consciousness and identity, and the living center of everything that made you who you were. And through all of it, through the declarations and the watching and the recording and the waiting, Anubis is in the room. He brought you here. He walked the road with you. He held your hand on the approach, and now he is kneeling beside the scale, making sure that what is about to happen is done correctly, that the instrument of measurement is true, that nothing in the process is skewed in either direction, that the judgment about to be rendered reflects what is actually in your heart and nothing else. He is not deciding your fate. He is making sure that your fate is decided honestly. There is a quality to that service that is easy to underestimate. In a room full of gods with agendas, in a process with eternal consequences, in a moment when everything depends on the accuracy of the measurement, the most important thing is that the scale is right, not tilted, not influenced, not reflecting anything other than the actual weight of the actual heart on its actual pan. Anubis kneels beside the scale, and he makes sure that is his role in this room. The commitment to honesty, the guarantee that whatever the scale says is what the scale means. And in a room where everything is at stake, that guarantee is the most important thing in it. Look at the papyrus of Hunefer again. The scene of the weighing of the heart is one of the most reproduced images in the entire history of ancient Egyptian art. It has appeared in textbooks and museum catalogues and documentaries and tattooed onto the arms of people who encountered it at some point in their lives and found that they could not stop thinking about it. The image has a hold on the human imagination that 3,000 years of other imagery has not loosened. Look at what is actually in it. Anubis is kneeling at the center of the composition, his hands near the scale, overseeing the balance with the attention of someone for whom this measurement is the most consequential thing in the room. On one pan of the scale, the heart of Hunefer. On the other pan, the feather of Maat, so light that it barely seems to register on the scale at all. Thoth stands to one side, with his palette ready to record whatever the balance reveals. Ammit crouches at the base of the scale, patient, in the way that things that do not need to hurry are patient. Osiris sits on his throne at the far end of the scene, the entire process oriented toward him. Everything in the image pointing in the direction of the king of the dead, who will receive Hunefer if Hunefer passes, and Hunefer himself stands just off to the left, being led by Anubis toward the scale, with an expression that the ancient artist has rendered with a subtlety that still communicates across 32 centuries, the expression of someone who has come a long way to reach this moment and is not entirely sure what the moment holds for them. He looks the way people look when the thing they have been preparing for their entire lives is finally, actually, happening. Now step back from the image and think about what the scale is actually measuring. The IB, the heart in the Egyptian understanding, was not simply an organ. It was the seat of consciousness, the center of thought and feeling and moral life. When the ancient Egyptians said that a person thought with their heart, they meant it literally, in the sense that the heart was understood as the physical location of everything we would now associate with the mind, with the inner life, with the subjective experience of being a particular person in a particular world. The IB was the keeper of record. Every experience you had registered in the heart. Every choice you made left a trace there. Every moment when you saw a situation clearly and responded to what you saw. Every moment when you looked away or told yourself a story that made your behavior easier to live with. Every kindness and every cruelty and every ordinary nothing day where you simply moved through the world without thinking about whether your movement through it was leaving things better or worse than you found them. The heart remembered all of it. This is the element of the Egyptian judgment that people who encounter it for the first time tend to find most surprising and most unsettling. There is no confession required. There is no accounting to a divine figure who has been watching and tallying and will now confront you with a list. There is no possibility of deathbed revision. No moment where you explain the context or offer the extenuating circumstances or point to the things you did that should count in your favor. The heart simply weighs what it weighs. The scales of Maat are not punitive. They do not add weight. They measure what is there. If you spent your life in the accumulation of anxiety that had no basis in reality, in resentment that you never resolved, in guilt that you carried without ever doing anything to address its source, in the weight of other people's opinions about who you should be rather than the clarity of your own understanding of who you were, the heart reflects all of that accumulation, not as punishment, as fact. And if you spent your life in something closer to lightness, not lightness in the sense of never experiencing difficulty or grief or the full weight of what being alive requires, but lightness in the sense of meeting what you met without accumulating more than was actually given to you, without holding on to what needed to be released, without building structures of self-deception that required constant maintenance and added their own weight to everything else, then the heart reflects that too. The feather of Maat is not a test of perfection. It is a test of truth. The question the scale is asking is not whether you were good enough by any particular standard of goodness. It is asking whether the weight of your heart matches the weight of reality as it actually was, whether what you carried through your life was what was actually there to be carried, or whether you added to it in ways that served fear more than truth. Anubis kneels beside the scale and makes sure the measurement is accurate. He does not influence the result. He does not tip the scale in anyone's direction. He ensures that what the scale says is what the scale means, and what the scale means is what the heart actually contains. And here is the question that the ancient Egyptians embedded in this image, the question that has kept it alive in the human imagination for 3,000 years and shows no sign of releasing its hold. If your heart were placed on that scale right now, in this moment, at the end of the life you have lived up to this point, and not some imagined better version of it, the actual life with its actual choices and its actual accumulations, how would it balance against the feather? The ancient Egyptians understood something that most modern culture circles around without quite landing on the heaviness we carry is not always given to us. Some of it we pick up ourselves, and some of what we pick up we do not need to be carrying. And the habit of putting things down that do not belong to us is not a spiritual luxury, but a practical necessity. If we intend to arrive at the end of our lives with hearts that can balance against a feather, Anubis makes sure the scale is true. What is on the scale? Only you put there. And when the pans settle and the balance is clear and Thoth lifts his pen and begins to record the result, the room is completely quiet. Just the scale, and the truth of whatever it shows. If the heart is light, if it balances against the feather, or comes close enough that Maat is satisfied, Thoth records a life that has passed. Horus steps forward to lead Hunefer to Osiris. The journey continues. The field of reeds. The Egyptian paradise. The world on the other side of judgment, where the blessed dead continue their existence in a landscape that resembles the best version of the world they left, waits on the other side of the throne. And if the heart is heavy, if the weight of accumulated untruth and unresolved grief and unnecessary burden tips the scale in the wrong direction, then the room has one more figure whose role in the judgment has not yet been described. That figure has been waiting at the base of the scale since before Hunnifer arrived. It has been waiting since before any of us arrived. It has all the time in the world. And its patience, as it turns out, is the most terrifying thing about it. Nobody talks about Ammit the way she deserves to be talked about. She appears in documentaries about ancient Egypt as a footnote, a curiosity, the strange creature at the bottom of the scale that adds visual drama to the weighing of the heart scene. She gets a sentence or two. Her 3 animal components are listed, and then the documentary moves on to something else, because the assumption is that Ammit is essentially decorative, a monster in the background whose purpose is to make the judgment scene look more ominous. That assumption misses everything important about her. Ammit is not decoration. Ammit is the answer to the question that every civilization that has ever built a system of afterlife judgment has had to answer: what happens to the people who do not pass? And the Egyptian answer to that question is so different from the answers that most of us were raised with, and so much more disturbing in its particular way, that it requires sitting with for a moment before moving on. Look at her. The ancient Egyptians built Ammit out of the 3 most dangerous animals in their known world. The head of a crocodile, which in ancient Egypt was not a distant natural history subject, but a daily presence along the Nile. The animal that could take a person off a riverbank in a second and drag them under before anyone had registered that something had happened. The front half of a lion, the apex predator of the desert edges, powerful enough and fast enough that an encounter with one in the wrong circumstances was simply the end. The hindquarters of a hippopotamus, one of the most feared and dangerous animals along the Nile, capable of moving with a speed that nothing that large had any right to achieve. 3 creatures, each the most dangerous thing in its environment, combined into one being whose single function is to consume what the scale sends her way. She does not move around the room. She does not pace or threaten or display herself. She simply crouches at the base of the scale and waits with the particular stillness of something that knows with absolute certainty that it will eventually receive what it is waiting for. That patience is not required of her in any effortful sense, because the outcome is never in doubt. Eventually, she will eat. The only question is whose heart she will be given. Now, here is where the Egyptian vision of what Ammit does becomes so much stranger and more unsettling than anything a monster in the background of a judgment scene would normally produce. She does not send the person whose heart she consumes to a place of punishment. Many later images of punishment after death imagine suffering that continues, realms of torment, fires that do not go out, consequences that extend forever. The ancient Egyptians built something different, something that, in its own way, is more absolute. Ammit eats the heart, and the person who owned that heart ceases to exist, not in the sense of dying, because that already happened, in the sense of being erased from the fabric of existence so completely that there is no longer any form in which they continue. The car dissolves. The bar has nowhere to return. The name, without any living aspect of the person to anchor it, fades from whatever record the divine universe keeps of the lives that have passed through it. The specific individual, the particular combination of memories and experiences and relationships and choices that made this person into who they were, and no one else, simply stops being anywhere at all. The ancient Egyptians called this the second death. The first death was the death of the body. That was survivable, with the right preparation and the right guide and the right result on the scale. The second death was the death of the person entirely, the death of every possibility of continuation in any form, the death that left nothing behind. Not even the potential of a name to be spoken, or a tomb to be maintained, or a memory to be held by someone who had loved you. This is what Ammit administers. Not punishment, erasure. And if you sit with that distinction long enough, you start to understand why the ancient Egyptians found it more terrifying than ongoing torment could have been. Because suffering, even severe suffering, is at least a form of existence. Something is still there to suffer. Some continuity of self persists in a realm of punishment. The person is still somewhere, which means the person still is. Ammit eliminates the somewhere. After Ammit, there is no is. The person is not suffering in darkness. The person is not wandering in a grey in-between. The person is not anywhere at all, which is an outcome so different from anything we have language for that the language tends to fail around it. We say non-existence, and the word lands lightly because we have no experience to attach to it. The ancient Egyptians understood, with a clarity that their entire death religion was built to address, that non-existence was the only truly irreversible outcome, that you could survive death, with the right preparation and the right guide and the right result on the scale, but you could not survive Ammit. Ammit was the end of ends, the erasure that could not be undone, and she sat there, at the base of the scale, in the Hall of Two Truths, in full view of every person who entered that room, so that no one could miss what was at stake. This is the detail that reveals something essential about how the ancient Egyptians used their theology. They did not hide Ammit. They did not put her in a separate room or describe her only in texts that the general population would never read. They painted her into the most widely reproduced image in their entire funerary tradition, the scene of the scale, the scene that appeared in tomb after tomb and on papyrus scroll after papyrus scroll for thousands of years. She was part of the picture on purpose, because the ancient Egyptians understood that knowing what was at stake changed how you lived, not through fear in the debilitating, paralyzing sense, but through clarity, through the knowledge that the choices you made accumulated in a real and measurable way, that the heart you were building day by day with every decision you made was the heart that would eventually be placed on the scale, that nothing about that accumulation was hidden or arbitrary. Ammit made the stakes visible, and visible stakes, in a system built around the belief that you had genuine agency over the weight of your own heart, were not cruelty. They were information. The information that the ancient Egyptians wanted everyone to carry through their lives, that what you do matters, in the most literal and ultimate sense, that the heart you bring to the scale is the heart you spent your life building, and that the creature waiting at the base of the scale is patient enough to wait for anyone whose building choices have been made poorly. She is still waiting. She has always been waiting. The ancient Egyptians hoped, through every amulet and every spell and every offering and every prayer and the entire elaborate infrastructure of their death religion, to give every person who died the best possible chance of arriving at the scale with a heart that balanced against the feather. They knew, with the realism of a civilization that had watched enough human lives to understand what they contained, that not every heart would balance. Ammit crouches at the base of the scale and confirms that knowledge with her presence. The universe is honest about consequences. Within the Egyptian ritual imagination, Anubis makes sure the scale is honest about weight, and Ammit makes sure that the outcome of the measurement is real. Together, they constitute a system of accountability so thorough and so honest that it has no gaps. There is only the heart, and the feather, and the scale between them, and the patient creature waiting below, and the god kneeling beside it all, making sure that what the scale says is what the scale means. That is the Hall of Two Truths. That is what waited at the end of every road through the Duat, for every person who died in ancient Egypt, from the greatest pharaoh in the most elaborate tomb to the poorest farmer with only a few spells on a scrap of papyrus. The scale did not ask what you owned. It only asked what you weighed. There was a time when Anubis was the face of death in Egypt, not a supporting figure in someone else's story, not the guardian who prepared the way for a more important god to take over. The face, the central divine presence in the Egyptian understanding of what happened when a person died and what came next. The god whose authority over the dead was primary and whose role in the funerary system was not secondary to anyone else's. Scholars who study the earliest layers of Egyptian religious history find evidence of this earlier prominence in fragments of text and iconography that predate the full development of the Osirian mythology as we know it. Anubis was associated with the dead and with the cemetery and with the processes of preservation from very early in Egyptian religious history, holding a position of central importance in the world of funerary belief that would later be reshaped by the rise of the Osirian tradition. Then, something changed. Not suddenly, not through a single theological revolution or a moment when one set of priests replaced another and rewrote everything. Egyptian religious history does not work that way. It works through accumulation, through the gradual layering of new belief over old, through the absorption of local traditions into larger frameworks as political and religious power shifted across the centuries. What changed over the long course of Egyptian religious development was the central question of the death religion. The earliest Egyptian funerary concern was essentially the one we have been following throughout this story: the protection of the body, the preservation of the name, the maintenance of the conditions that allowed the dead person to continue in some form. The focus was on prevention, on keeping the processes of dissolution at bay, on protecting the specific individual from the specific threats that death posed to their continued existence. That concern never went away. Everything we have discussed about embalming and tomb preparation, and the weighing of the heart, and the role of Anubis as guardian and guide, remained central to Egyptian death religion for the entire span of its history. But a new concern emerged alongside it: the question of resurrection, the story of Osiris, the murdered god who was reassembled and embalmed, and then raised to rule as king of the dead. Introduced into Egyptian theology, a possibility that went beyond preservation, not just the continuation of the dead person in some protected afterlife form, but the actual transformation of death into a new kind of life. The crossing of a threshold so absolute that what came out the other side was not simply the preserved version of what went in, but something that had passed through death and emerged from it with a different kind of existence. Osiris had died. Osiris had been embalmed. Osiris had passed through everything that the Egyptian death system required a person to pass through. And Osiris sat on a throne in the realm of the dead as king, as judge, as the divine embodiment of the promise that death was not the final word on what a person could be. That promise was bigger than preservation. It encompassed all of those things, required all of those things as its foundation. But it went further than they could go by themselves. Resurrection required a god of resurrection, and Osiris, by virtue of having undergone and survived the process himself, was uniquely positioned to hold that role. The shift that followed was gradual and is still being studied by scholars who work in this field. It was not the erasure of Anubis. Nothing in the Egyptian religious tradition that we have access to suggests that there was a moment when the priests gathered and decided that Anubis was to be demoted or diminished or replaced. What happened was more organic than that. More like the way that any complex system redistributes its functions when new functions become necessary, with the existing elements finding their places in a new configuration rather than being eliminated. Osiris moved to the center of the afterlife system. His story became the template, the model that every dead Egyptian was understood to be following. To die was to become Osiris. In the theological sense, the dead person was called Osiris in the funerary texts, addressed by that name. Their journey, understood as a repetition of his. They were reenacting the death and passage and potential resurrection of the god who had been the first to make the journey and return. Transformed. On the other side, Osiris sat on the throne in the Hall of Two Truths because he was the destination. He was the proof that the journey could be made. He was the answer to the question that the entire death system was organized around: what happens after the scale? For those whose hearts were light, Horus led them to Osiris, the god of kingship and protection. Son of Osiris and Isis, brought the justified dead into the presence of the king of the dead. And what followed was the entry into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, the world that continued on the other side of judgment in a form that resembled the best of the world left behind. Anubis was not on the throne. He had never been built for the throne. Not in the sense that Osiris was built for it. Osiris was a king by nature, by story, by the entire arc of his mythology. He sat at the center and received. He was the point toward which everything moved. Anubis was built for the threshold. He was built for the road, for the moment of crossing, for the space between one state and another, where most gods did not operate and most stories did not pause to describe. He was built for the work that had to happen before anyone could reach the throne. The embalming and the preservation and the guiding and the oversight of the scale. And as Osiris moved to the center of the afterlife system, Anubis moved to the threshold, not backward, not downward, to exactly the place he was built to occupy. The king of the dead sat on his throne and waited for the justified to be brought before him. Anubis stood at the door, and nobody, not the greatest pharaoh, and not the most beloved ordinary person, and not a single soul in the entire history of Egyptian death religion, got from the embalming table to the throne of Osiris without passing through the threshold where Anubis was standing. The throne required the door. The door required Anubis. That arrangement was not a demotion. It was a recognition of what Anubis had always been. The god of the crossing, the god of the moment when everything changes, the god of the space between what you were and what you were going to become. Osiris sat at the center and promised resurrection. Anubis stood at the threshold and made sure you could get there. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient without the other. There is a particular kind of power that does not look like power from the outside. It does not sit on a throne, or carry a scepter, or wear a crown that makes it identifiable from across a room. It does not require the acknowledgement of the people who benefit from it. And it does not diminish when those people turn their attention towards something more visually impressive. It is the power of the necessary thing, the thing without which everything else stops working, even if nobody is looking at it, even if the people depending on it have organized their understanding of the system around the more dramatic elements and forgotten to notice what is holding the whole structure up. Anubis had that kind of power. He always had it. The period after Osiris moved to the center of Egyptian death religion is where that power becomes most visible, precisely because Anubis himself became less visible in the central theological narrative. The mythology focused on Osiris. The funerary texts addressed the dead as Osiris. The imagery of the afterlife oriented itself around the throne in the Hall of Two Truths and the promise of resurrection that the figure on that throne represented. And Anubis was still at the door, still in the embalming room, still on the road through the duat, still kneeling at the scale. Nothing about his actual function had changed. The embalming still required his presence. The threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead still required his authority. The road through the duat still ran through his domain. The scale still needed someone to ensure it was balanced before the measurement began. He was still doing all of it. He was just no longer being called the Lord of the Dead. Think about what it takes to keep showing up to work that is essential but not celebrated. Most of us are familiar with the experience of doing something necessary, something that the whole system depends on, while the recognition and the attention flow towards something more visible, something that benefits from what you do without necessarily acknowledging the benefit. It is one of the more common and more quietly exhausting features of functioning within any complex structure, whether that structure is a family or an institution or a civilization. Anubis did it for thousands of years. He did not stop embalming bodies because Osiris became the god of resurrection. He did not abandon the road through the duat because the theology had reoriented itself around the destination rather than the journey. He did not step back from the scale because the king on the throne at the far end of the hall was receiving more theological attention than the god kneeling at the center of the room. He kept doing the work because the work was what he was, not what he was called. There is a distinction in the papyrus of Hunefer that rewards attention. In the weighing scene, Anubis is depicted at the scale. His authority ensures that the process is fair and accurate. After the weighing, when Hunefer's heart has proven light enough to pass, it is Horus who leads Hunefer to Osiris. Horus, not Anubis, completes the final presentation. Anubis remains at the scale. He does not follow Hunefer to the throne. His role in Hunefer's journey is complete at the scale, and he stays there while Hunefer moves forward into whatever comes next. This is a definition, not a limitation. Anubis is the god of the crossing. His domain ends where the destination begins, and the precision of that boundary is part of what makes him so essential. He does not do everything. He does the specific things that only he can do, completely and without failure. And then he steps back so that the next necessary thing can happen. The center changes. The threshold endures. Some gods rule from the center. They sit at the point toward which everything else moves, and they receive what comes to them, and they dispense from that position the outcomes that define the system. Anubis ruled the threshold, not the point toward which things moved, but the point through which they had to pass to get there. Not the destination, but the crossing that made arrival possible. And here is the thing about thresholds. You can build a more impressive destination. You can create a more powerful promise of what waits on the other side. You can develop more elaborate and more beautiful theology around the king on the throne and the paradise beyond the judgment and the resurrection that transforms death into something other than an ending. But the threshold does not change. Every person who wants to reach the destination still has to cross it. Every heart that hopes to be found light still has to be prepared and preserved and guided to the scale. Every journey through the duat still has to begin at the place where the living world ends and the road into the dark begins. And Anubis is still there. He is there because the threshold is real, and the threshold requires someone who knows it completely. And he is the one who knows it completely. And that knowledge does not become less essential because the system around it reorganizes itself. There is something in that arrangement that speaks to a kind of wisdom that most ambition does not reach. The wisdom of understanding what you actually are, rather than what position in a hierarchy you would prefer to occupy. The wisdom of doing the necessary thing fully. Because the necessary thing is what you are built for, and what you are built for is enough. Anubis was built for the door. He kept the door, and every person who ever passed through it. From the earliest dynasties of Egyptian history to the latest period of the ancient religion, passed through it with Anubis present on the other side. There, at the threshold, doing the work that the entire system depended on and that the entire system would have collapsed without. He survived because he was needed. He is still needed. 3,000 years later, when the civilization that built him had passed into history and the religion that gave him his function had been replaced by other answers to the questions he was created to address. His image was still on the door, on every threshold between one state and another, on every crossing from what was to what comes next, on every moment when a human being stands at the edge of something they cannot see clearly and needs. More than anything, the assurance that the crossing has been made before and someone knows the way. The center changes. The threshold endures, and the god at the threshold endures with it. In 1922, Howard Carter made a small hole in a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and held a candle to it. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked if he could see anything. Carter said yes. Wonderful things. What he was looking at was the antechamber of the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh who died around 1332 years before the Common Era and was buried with a speed and a completeness that preserved everything in a way that no other royal tomb had preserved anything. 3,250 years of sealed darkness. And then the candle, and then Carter's eyes adjusting to what the light was showing him. Among the wonderful things in that antechamber was a statue, black, life-sized, a figure with the body of a man and the head of a jackal, resting on a gilded shrine, oriented toward the sealed inner chamber where the king himself lay. The statue had been placed there to guard the passage between the outer world and the burial chamber, positioned at exactly the threshold between where the living could go and where only the dead were meant to be. When the photographs of that antechamber went out to the world in the weeks following the discovery, the black jackal figure appeared in newspapers and magazines and illustrated reports across every country where the story was being followed, which was essentially every country. It was one of the first images from the tomb that the general public encountered. Before the golden mask, before the sarcophagus, before any of the objects that have become more famous in the century since. The first image many people saw from the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century was Anubis at the threshold, standing guard, exactly where he had always been. The modern history of Anubis's image in Western culture begins approximately there. In the flood of Egyptian imagery that entered the popular consciousness following the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and never entirely receded. But it was not a new history. It was the continuation of something that had been running, in various forms. Since the ancient world ended, the Romans who conquered Egypt did not dismiss Egyptian religion as primitive or irrelevant. They were fascinated by it, as they were fascinated by anything old enough and elaborate enough to suggest depths they had not yet plumbed. Isis became one of the most widely worshipped goddesses in the Roman Empire, and Anubis traveled with her believers, finding new contexts for an old function, moving through a larger world while doing the same essential work he had always done. There are images of Anubis from Roman period Egypt that show him in Roman military dress, the jackal head above a soldier's uniform, the god of the Egyptian threshold, wearing the costume of the empire that had absorbed his civilization, the function unchanged beneath the different surface. The thing they found in him was what everyone has always found, something that knows the territory of death in a way that the living cannot, and that is willing to use that knowledge on your behalf. Then the 19th century happened to Egypt. Napoleon's expedition at the very end of the 1700s brought European scholars into direct contact with the monuments and texts of ancient Egypt in a way that produced, over the following decades, the field of Egyptology and a wave of popular fascination with Egyptian imagery that influenced architecture and design and literature across Europe and America. Egyptian motifs appeared on buildings, on furniture, on jewelry, on the decorative objects of a civilization that had encountered the aesthetic of a dead civilization and found it compelling in ways it could not entirely explain. Anubis was part of that wave, and then the 20th century gave him the movies, the Mummy films, beginning with the Universal Pictures production of 1932 and continuing through multiple iterations across the following decades and into the 21st century. Built their visual language around Egyptian funerary imagery, and consistently used Anubis and the imagery of Egyptian death religion as shorthand for ancient and threatening power. These films got most of the theology wrong, but they got something right about the image. The black jackal figure registers immediately, even for audiences who know nothing about ancient Egyptian religion, as something that belongs to a world with different rules than the one they inhabit. The image works across cultures and across centuries because it was built to work. Neil Gaiman, in his novel American Gods, wrote a version of Anubis operating a funeral home in Cairo, Illinois, a small American town named perhaps not accidentally. After the ancient capital of Egypt, a god who had followed his believers across the ocean and found that the work in the new world was essentially the same as the work in the old one. People died. Bodies needed care. The crossing still happened, and the god who had always presided over that crossing was still there to preside over it, wearing different clothes in a different landscape, but doing the same thing he had always done. Gaiman's Anubis is one of the most honest portrayals of the god in modern fiction, not because it is archaeologically precise, but because it understands something essential. The function does not become obsolete just because the mythology that originally housed it has passed out of general belief. The work of caring for the dead, of standing with the dying, of presiding with knowledge and without flinching over the threshold that everyone must eventually cross, is work that does not go away. The people doing that work in the modern world, the hospice nurses and the funeral directors and the grief counselors and the people who choose, for professional or personal reasons, to be present at the edges of life and death where most people prefer not to go, are doing the work that Anubis was built to represent. They are the ones who know the threshold. They are the ones who stay. There is a community of people, growing larger every year, who describe themselves as part of the death-positive movement. They are doctors and nurses and funeral workers and ordinary people who have decided that the modern tendency to push death out of sight, to manage it medically and administratively in ways that remove it from the ordinary experience of daily life, has costs that are not worth paying. They talk openly about dying and grief and the specific texture of loss. Many of them have Anubis imagery in their homes or on their bodies, not because they worship him in the theological sense, because they recognize him, because the figure that the ancient Egyptians built to represent the god who stands at the threshold, who knows the territory of death without being destroyed by that knowledge, who accompanies the dying without pulling away, is a figure that speaks to something they understand from their own experience. He is the image of the person who does not look away, who goes toward the thing that most people retreat from, who knows the hard terrain and walks it with you anyway. Tutankhamun's tomb has been open for over a century now. The black statue of Anubis is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. No longer guarding the threshold it was made to guard. Surrounded by climate-controlled cases and museum lighting and the shuffling feet of visitors from every country in the world who come to see the wonderful things that Howard Carter found in 1922. But something of what the statue was doing in that antechamber is still being done, not by the statue, by the image it carries, which has been in continuous circulation since the first person looked at a jackal-like canid at the edge of a cemetery and understood, in the part of the brain that operates below language, that here was something that belonged to the space between the living and the dead, in a way that demanded to be made into a god. That image is still working, still recognizable, still stopping people in their tracks, because it is the image of a question that the ancient Egyptians asked and that has not been answered in any way that makes the image unnecessary. Anubis survived because he answered a question no civilization has ever outgrown. When the crossing comes, will anyone know the way? In the world that created him, he was the answer. He remains the answer that the question reaches for. Even now, even in a world that barely remembers the civilization that built him, some answers outlast the questions they were made to address, and some gods outlast the worlds that created them, not because they are worshipped, because the need they were made to meet has not changed. People still die. The threshold still exists. And the figure at the threshold, the one with the knowledge of the territory and the willingness to use it, is still the most necessary figure in the room. Go back to the house made of mud brick on the edge of the Nile. The family is still sitting in the dark. The man who built the house is still gone. The question that the opening of this story left hanging in the air of that room, the question that no grief in any century has ever been able to avoid, is still there. unanswered, taking up exactly as much space as it always has. What happens to him now? We have traveled a long way since that question was first asked. We have stood at the edge of desert cemeteries at sunset and watched the jackal-like canids move through the shadows. We have been inside the beautiful house and breathed the smell of natron and cedar oil and understood, for the first time, what 70 days of careful work in that silence actually meant. We have sat with the story of a family whose complications ran all the way through the divine world, and watched a god come to the assembled pieces of another god and do the work that nobody else knew how to do and that nobody asked him to do, and that changed everything. We have walked the road through the duat. We have stood in the Hall of Two Truths and watched Anubis kneel beside the scale and understood what it means to be the god who guarantees the honesty of the measurement, rather than the god who decides the outcome. We have watched Osiris move to the center and Anubis remain at the door. We have followed the image of that door across 3,000 years of human history, through Roman Egypt and the 19th century fascination and the 20th century cinema and the death-positive movement and the hospice nurse who chooses every day to be present at the threshold that most people choose to stay away from. And now we are back in the mud brick house, with the family, with the question. The ancient Egyptians would not have experienced that question the way we tend to experience it. They would not have sat with it as an unanswerable weight, as the void that opens up when someone we love stops existing, and we cannot follow them into whatever comes next, and we cannot know what comes next, and we cannot make the not knowing stop hurting. They had a framework, not a comfort in the soft, reassuring sense of something that makes the pain smaller. A framework in the structural sense, a set of answers that organized the grief into something with a shape, something that could be acted on, something that gave the family sitting in the dark specific things to do with their love for the person they had lost that would actually help the person they had lost. Call the priests. Begin the preparation. Do the work of the 70 days. Maintain the offerings. Keep the name spoken. And underneath all of that, as the foundation on which all of it rested, the knowledge that the person who had just crossed the threshold of this house for the last time had not crossed into nothing, that there was a road, and a guide, and a judgment, and beyond the judgment, the possibility of a continued existence whose quality reflected the quality of the life that had earned it. The framework did not make death small. The ancient Egyptians did not minimize death. They built the most elaborate and most sustained funerary culture in human history, a culture that devoted enormous resources and extraordinary ingenuity to the management of death across 3,000 years, because they understood that death was the largest thing a human being ever encountered, and it deserved to be treated as exactly that. They made death large, and then they filled the largeness with meaning, with practice, with the specific actions that a person who loved someone could take on behalf of that person, with the God who stood at the threshold and knew the road and would not let the crossing be made alone. That is what Anubis was for. Not to make death easy, to make it possible to face. There is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. Easy is what we tend to want from our beliefs about death. We want the reassurance that removes the fear, that closes the gap, that tells us, in language clear enough to rest, in that everything is going to be all right. We want the framework that softens the hardest fact about being alive, that it ends, and that we do not know what ending means. The ancient Egyptians did not build Anubis to give people easy. They built him to give people company. The distinction matters because company, in the context of the most frightening thing a human being can face, is not a diminished version of easy. It is something more honest and more durable. Easy is always at risk of being contradicted by what you actually experience. Company is already present in the experience itself. You do not need the fear to go away for company to be real. You only need someone to be there while the fear is doing what fear does. Anubis was there. He had always been there. Since the first person looked at the canid moving through the cemetery at sunset and understood that the territory of the dead needed someone who knew it, and made that knowledge divine. He is still there, in the sense that images persist when the needs that created them persist, and the need that created Anubis, the need for a figure who knows the threshold and walks it with you, has not become less urgent in 3,000 years of human civilization, finding new ways to answer old questions. We live in a culture that has, by and large, moved death out of the center of daily life and into specialized institutions and professional domains. A culture that has made dying a medical event managed by experts rather than a human passage managed by community. A culture that has produced people who reach the end of their lives having had almost no direct experience of death as a close and present reality, and therefore no framework for what to do when it arrives. The ancient Egyptians would find this strange, not because they were morbid or obsessed with death, because they understood that a life lived without a relationship to death is a life lived without a relationship to the most fundamental fact about being alive. The death that waits at the end of every human story is not a surprise ending. It is the condition that gives the story its shape. It is the threshold whose existence makes every step before it meaningful. They built Anubis to stand at that threshold. They built him to be recognizable, to be findable, to be the one constant in the landscape of death that the living could orient themselves by when everything else was uncertain and changing and beyond their control. He is still recognizable. 3,000 years after the civilization that created him has passed into history. His image still stops people in their tracks, still gets tattooed onto arms, still appears in the novels of writers who understand something about the persistence of ancient needs in modern forms, still stands in the imaginations of hospice workers and in the visual vocabulary of a culture that does not worship him, but still reaches for him when it needs an image for the one who knows what comes after. The family in the mud brick house eventually moved. They did what grieving families have always done. They came back to the requirements of the living. They made the arrangements. They called the people who needed to be called. They began the long process of understanding how a world that contained this person now had to reorganize itself around his absence. But before they moved, in the last moment of sitting in the dark with the question, they knew something that the Egyptian world had given them, and that made the sitting possible. He was not alone out there. Someone was at the door, someone who knew every road beyond it, who had walked those roads 10,000 times before tonight, and would walk them 10,000 times more, who had kneeled at the scale that waited at the end of those roads and made sure it was honest, who had been present at every crossing since the first person was buried in the sand at the edge of the green world, and the first family sat in the dark with the first version of this exact question. That someone had the face of the thing they feared most, and that face, when you understood it, when you looked at it directly instead of looking away, was not the face of destruction. It was the face of the one who does not destroy, the one who preserves, the one who guides, the one who kneels beside the scale and keeps it honest, the one who takes your hand at the beginning of the road and does not let go until the road is finished, one who was already at the door before you knew you needed him. Anubis, the god of the crossing, the god of the threshold that everyone who has ever lived must eventually cross, the god who looked at 3,000 years of human death and did not flinch. The door is still open. He is still there. In the world that created him, everyone needed him, and the question that made him necessary has not changed. When will someone be there? The ancient Egyptians built their answer out of black paint and jackal bones and 70 days of careful silence in a room they called the beautiful house. Their answer stood at the threshold. Their answer knew the way. And wherever people still gather in the dark after someone they loved has stopped breathing, asking the question that families have always asked, that answer is still the most honest one ever given to the most human question there is. Not fire, not a throne, not a voice from the sky, just a figure at the door, with the face of the thing you feared most, and the knowledge of every road beyond it, waiting, as he has always waited, for you.